I thought my life was set in stone, routine, predictable, and untouched by passion. But one unexpected encounter changed everything. It started with a glance, then a touch, and before I knew it, I was waiting in a dark parking lot, heart racing, knowing I was about to cross a line I never imagined. What happens when desire wakes up after years of silence? Stay with me, because this story is just beginning. The day started like any other. I woke up to the soft hum of the radio, made a cup of coffee that tasted the same as it had for years, and headed to my small vintage shop on the corner of a quiet street in Redwood. My days were predictable, a rhythm set long ago, with no expectations of excitement or change. Life had settled into a quiet solitude, not unbearable, but heavy in a way that lingered in the background, never quite fading. I had been alone for a long time. Not in a tragic, weeping-at-night way, but in a subtle sense, one that made itself known in small, unexpected moments. Like when I reached for a second cup of coffee out of habit, only to remember no one else was there to drink it. Or when I walked past a couple in the grocery store, their hands brushing absent-mindedly, a kind of connection I hadn't felt in years. It had been 8 years since Mark left, since the divorce that had felt less like an ending and more like an erasure. One day he was there, part of my life, our shared world intact, and the next, he was gone. At 56, I knew how people saw me. A woman past the age of adventure, settled into her ways, unlikely to stir the waters of her routine. I had come to accept it, or so I thought. Until that afternoon. I was at the supermarket, a mundane trip for essentials. The store was brightly lit, sterile in its predictability. I moved through the aisles on autopilot, picking up the same groceries I always did. The monotony was comforting, in a way. Nothing unexpected, nothing new. And then I saw him. I hadn't noticed him at first. The line at the register was short, and my mind was elsewhere, absorbed in the unimportant details of my day. But when I set my basket down and looked up, my breath caught. The cashier was unlike anyone I'd ever seen working in a place like this. Tall, probably around 6'4", with lean muscle that stretched his uniform in all the right places. His dark, wavy hair looked effortlessly tousled, as if he just rolled out of bed, and his face, sharp jawline, strong features, piercing hazel eyes, was nothing short of arresting. He had the kind of presence that made time slow, his every movement fluid and confident. I felt ridiculous for staring, but something about him made it impossible to look away. My fingers gripped the handle of the basket a little tighter as I watched him scan the items of the customer in front of me. He moved with an easy grace, completely unaware of the effect he had. When it was finally my turn, I placed my items on the belt, forcing myself to focus. But as he began scanning my groceries, his gaze met mine, and something unfamiliar stirred inside me. It was just a moment, a fleeting connection, but my heart stuttered in my chest. He had an easy smile, effortless and warm, and when he spoke, his voice was deep, smooth, the kind that settled into your bones. I barely heard what he said, nodding absent-mindedly as I tried to keep my expression neutral. Heat rose to my cheeks, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. It was absurd, really. I was a grown woman, not some schoolgirl losing her composure over a handsome man. But still, the rush of awareness prickled along my skin. I reached for my wallet with unsteady fingers, fumbling with the bills as I handed him a tip, a small thing, barely anything, but more than I had ever given to a cashier before. He took it with a nod, his fingers brushing mine ever so slightly, and the brief contact sent a current through my veins. As I left the store, stepping into the crisp autumn air, I exhaled sharply, gripping the plastic bags tighter than necessary. The cool wind did little to calm the heat still simmering inside me. I shook my head, scolding myself under my breath. It was just a simple interaction, nothing more. But as I sat behind the wheel of my car, staring at the dashboard, I knew it wasn't that simple. I could still see his face, still feel the way my pulse had quickened under his gaze. For the first time in years, something had shifted. And I wasn't sure I was ready for it. The days that followed were different. I didn't want them to be. I tried to convince myself they weren't, but I knew better. Every time I stepped into my shop, turned the key in the lock, and set up for another slow day of waiting for customers who rarely came, I found my mind drifting. It wasn't the usual idle daydreams or the nagging thoughts about how business had plateaued years ago. No, it was him. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But each time I brewed my morning coffee, I found myself thinking of his hands, strong, confident, effortlessly moving across the register. When I walked past the mirror in my hallway, I stopped for just a second longer, wondering what he had seen when he looked at me. Had I looked tired? Older than I felt? Did he even notice at all? By the third day, I had stopped pretending. I knew I wanted to see him again. The thought was ridiculous, but it didn't matter. I had to go back. The problem was, I had no real reason to. My fridge was still stocked, my cupboards full. And yet, that evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, I found myself grabbing my keys and heading to the store. It was busier this time. More people, more noise, but none of it mattered. I only cared about one thing, whether he was there. I pretended to browse the produce section, picking up a few apples I didn't need. I lingered by the dairy aisle, letting my fingers trace the cool metal of the shelves as I searched for an excuse to stay longer. But still, no sign of him. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe he wasn't real in the way I had made him in my mind. Maybe he was just another fleeting moment of fascination, something my lonely heart had latched onto because it was desperate to feel something again. I sighed, resigning myself to disappointment, and turned toward the checkout lanes. And then I saw him. He was working a different register this time, closer to the entrance, his head tilted slightly as he chatted with a customer. That smile, the same effortless charm that had unraveled me days before, lit up his face, and for a moment, I forgot to move. It was foolish, really, how quickly my body reacted. My heart raced, my palms grew damp. But I forced myself to keep my composure. One step, then another, until I reached his line. I placed my handful of unnecessary groceries on the belt, silently scolding myself for my own ridiculousness. As he scanned my items, I felt the moment stretch between us again, the same quiet awareness lingering just beneath the surface. I wanted to say something, to make it less obvious that I had come here for reasons that had nothing to do with groceries. But what could I say? Instead, I just watched him, studying the way his hands moved, the way his lashes cast faint shadows across his cheekbones under the fluorescent lights. And when our eyes met, I swore, just for a second, that he saw through everything, that he knew why I was here. I left the store that night with more than just a bag of apples and a carton of milk. I left with a lingering ache, a restlessness I hadn't felt in years. And I knew I'd be back again. I told myself I wouldn't go back so soon. That I had no reason to. But the thought of him lingered, weaving itself into the quiet moments of my day. It was absurd, how quickly this fixation had taken root. I wasn't some infatuated girl, yet here I was, finding excuses to return to the store. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting curiosity. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. By the end of the week, I had run out of things to justify another trip. The apples sat untouched in my kitchen, the milk barely half empty, and the bread still fresh. There was no need to go, no logical reason to step into that store again. And yet, as the sun set behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the pavement, I found myself reaching for my keys, the weight of them in my palm feeling heavier than usual. The store was quieter than before, the late hour leaving only a handful of shoppers wandering the aisles. My heart quickened as I entered, scanning the registers as inconspicuously as I could. He was there. Standing at the same register, his posture relaxed, hands moving effortlessly as he rang up a customer's items. I forced myself to slow down, to appear casual as I moved through the aisles. I picked up a loaf of bread I didn't need, a bottle of wine I'd probably let sit unopened, and a few other things that held no real purpose. The shelves, usually unremarkable, seemed oddly vibrant tonight, as if the store had taken on a new presence in my life. Each step closer to the checkout felt heavier, anticipation pressing against my ribs, my breath shallow and uneven. When I finally reached his register, he looked up, and our eyes met. That same flicker of recognition. The same warmth in his expression. A familiarity that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. It felt like a thread tying us together, something unseen but undeniably present. He scanned my items, moving with that effortless grace I had come to admire. I found myself watching his hands, noting the way his fingers worked quickly but with a certain ease, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. His presence was commanding in a way I couldn't quite explain, and I wondered how many people before me had stopped to take notice. Probably plenty. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was charged, expectant. I could feel it in the way he held my gaze for just a moment longer than necessary, in the slight curve of his lips when he handed me my receipt. A quiet exchange of something unspoken, something that made my skin prickle with awareness. I took the bag, fingers brushing against his. A fleeting touch, but enough to make my breath hitch, a sharp intake that I quickly tried to cover with a nod of thanks. The sensation of warmth from that brief contact lingered, spreading through me like the faintest ember of a fire I had forgotten could exist. I hesitated, gripping the strap of my purse as if anchoring myself. The moment stretched, a heartbeat too long, and I wondered if he felt it too. I stood there, my pulse drumming steadily, my mind grasping for something to say. I wanted to ask him something, anything to prolong the moment. Maybe where he was from, how long he had worked there, what he did outside of this fluorescent-lit place. But the words never left my mouth, dissolving on my tongue before they could form. By the time I stepped outside, the cool air felt sharp against my skin. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady the racing of my pulse. The night was quiet, the hum of distant traffic the only sound beyond my own thoughts. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, trying to push away the warmth that still clung to my skin, the lingering effect of something I couldn't quite define. I had no reason to come back. No excuse left to justify another visit. And yet, I knew I would. Something had shifted inside me, something that refused to be ignored. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it was foolish, but the truth was undeniable. I would see him again. I hadn't planned on going back that night. I had told myself I would wait, let some time pass before I allowed myself another excuse. But when the late afternoon stretched into evening, I felt restless, unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. I paced my apartment, tidied the kitchen counters, rearranged the books on the coffee table, anything to distract myself. But it didn't work. My mind kept drifting, my body tense with unspent energy. And so, once again, I grabbed my keys. The drive to the store felt different this time. The anticipation was heavier, more deliberate. This wasn't just another accidental encounter. I was choosing to go. Choosing to step into whatever this was becoming. I had no expectations, no real plan, only the undeniable pull that had taken hold of me. The store was nearly empty when I arrived. The overhead lights cast a pale glow across the tiled floors, and the soft hum of the refrigerators was the only background noise. I made my way through the aisles with little care for what I picked up. A bottle of wine, some fruit, a few things I didn't even bother looking at. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether he was here. And then I saw him. He was standing near the entrance, finishing up with a customer, his head tilted slightly as he listened. His posture was relaxed, effortless, and for a moment, I simply watched him. There was something captivating about the way he existed in the space, as if he belonged there but was meant for something more. His presence had an energy I couldn't ignore, and it made my pulse quicken despite myself. I forced myself to move forward, pretending to focus on the shelves, though my mind was elsewhere. I felt ridiculous, acting like some infatuated woman chasing a fleeting fantasy. But that didn't stop me. It didn't slow my steps as I made my way toward the registers. When I reached his line, he looked up, his gaze settling on me with a flicker of recognition. There was something different in his expression this time, curiosity, maybe, or amusement. As he scanned my items, the space between us felt smaller than before, charged with something unspoken. Every movement, every brush of his fingers against the items, felt magnified. I watched his hands, the way they moved with quiet confidence, and my mind wandered to places it shouldn't. To thoughts I hadn't allowed myself in years. I didn't say anything, and neither did he. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Heavy. Something passed between us, something intangible but undeniable. And when he handed me the receipt, his fingers lingered against mine just a second longer than necessary. A simple touch. Barely anything. But it sent a shiver through me, setting my skin alight with awareness. I swallowed hard, gripping the bag in my hand like an anchor. I needed to say something, anything to break the moment before it swallowed me whole. But before I could find the words, he spoke first. Closing up soon. His voice was low, smooth, just loud enough for me to hear. I nodded, my throat dry. I understood what he was saying. What he was offering. And as I walked toward the exit, my heartbeat thrumming in my ears, I knew that when the store closed for the night, I wouldn't be driving home just yet. That I waited in my car, the engine off, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. My fingers drummed idly against the steering wheel, my heart pounding with a steady rhythm that matched the pulse in my throat. The minutes felt stretched, elongated by anticipation, by the weight of what was about to happen. Through the windshield, I watched the store's fluorescent lights flicker as the last few customers trickled out. The automatic doors slid open and shut, until finally, they stopped. The store was closed. The parking lot, nearly empty. And then, there he was. He stepped out, keys dangling in his hand, his posture loose, unhurried. He didn't look around, didn't search for me, but somehow, I knew he was aware that I was there. My breath caught as he walked past the rows of parked cars, the faint sound of his footsteps swallowed by the night air. I could have driven away then. Turned the key in the ignition, let reason pull me back to my quiet apartment, my familiar bed, my predictable life. But I didn't. I opened the door, stepped out, and met him halfway. The space between us felt smaller now, charged in a way that made the air thick, heavy with something neither of us had put into words. He stopped a few feet in front of me, his gaze steady, unreadable. The cool breeze shifted between us, but I barely felt it. No words were spoken. None were needed. He lifted his hand, fingers brushing against my wrist, the lightest touch but enough to send a current through me, setting every nerve on edge. I swallowed, my breath uneven, my body alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. He didn't rush, didn't assume. He waited. Letting me decide, letting me be the one to close the distance. And I did. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped forward, until I could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His lips parted slightly, as if about to say something, but I didn't let him. Instead, I reached for him, my fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt, pulling him toward me. The first touch was hesitant, searching. A slow unraveling of restraint, of something we had both been holding back. But the hesitation didn't last long. Soon, his hands were on me, steady, warm, guiding. The world around us faded, lost in the quiet hum of the night, in the space we had created between us. I wasn't thinking about tomorrow, or what this meant, or what anyone would say. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking at all. I was feeling. And I didn't want to stop.